Next question, and once again in the context of meetings, what about the children? What do you do with the children during these meetings that we're talking about?
If there's any one question that I guess we probably heard more than all the others put together from people in other countries and cities, it's been about children. And I think rightfully so, because it can be a source of major difficulty, as well as I think people have an innate sense that shipping the kids off someplace else constantly isn't necessarily the healthiest thing for them spiritually. To be discipled by their peers isn't necessarily what God has in mind for His people. If God sets the lonely in families and then sets the children in programs, it seems like He's working against Himself. And God's desire is that we'd be a family. Now, back in the earlier parts of this country that we live in, this idea of nuclear family, the 4 people, mom, dad, and 2.4 children, that thing really wasn't the way people lived. Back in earlier eras in our country's history, as well as in the majority of the rest of the world, even today, grandma, grandpa, aunts and uncles, cousins, there's always that dynamic of life in the family where a child isn't really being raised by his peers in a program of kids all his height and his own basic spiritual level, with a couple of people assigned or paid to oversee their spiritual well-being, or physical well-being. Kids grew up maybe on a farm and they got to see, calves being born and little lambs being born, and they could see the nature of life, and in the family they had grandma and grandpa teaching them, as well as the parents, and other relationships with adults, and all those kinds of things were always going on. There was that dynamic of life in earlier eras of our country that provided for a very solid basis of maturity and work ethic and so on for the people that were growing up in that generation. And the same is true spiritually even today, that a lot of the problems, again, with the immorality and drugs and alcohol and vices of every kind, the language problems, disrespect, selfishness, worldliness, the patterns of the world, the cool clothes, and all the things that the teenagers in the, quote, churches are so prone to fall into the trap of, just like in the world. Very little difference, really, statistically speaking. There's good kids in the world, there's a few good kids in the youth programs, but basically the worldliness level is very similar. The statistics show that to be true. That's really a crime. That's a terrible crime, and the church really isn't who she needs to be if that's really happening that way. Well, you can trace part of the source of all of that into the fact that we've created a junior worship, and we've created, even advertised, Bible classes for kids of all ages, and behind door number 1 is the kindergartners, and door number 2 is the first and second graders, and there might be only 2 kids in there, and they're both pulling each other's hair the whole time, but we've done our duty if we've had a flannel graph and we've done all the things and run little stories and vacation Bible school and all. It's like, it seems like good work, but it wears people out. It just kills them. Burnout galore of people that just don't even want to mess with it anymore. Good people that just get wore out. And secondly, it doesn't produce the kind of fruit that we want. We talked before what Jesus said about wisdom being proved right by her children. Well, of all things, this is certainly a good example. The wisdom that we've approached our children with historically in the religious system, Christendom, has not been wisdom that's bore good fruit. The nature of God's people in the last days is that the fathers would be turned to the children and the children would be turned to the fathers, and that there'd be relationships and families and adult-child relationships that didn't previously exist, perhaps. And so the restoration of God's heart is that children would be incorporated into the gifts in people's lives. And I had a professor at a Bible college ask me one time, he said, well, you travel some and you leave your kids behind sometimes when you do that, and don't you feel like that has a detrimental effect on them? And I said, well, perhaps it would if I was a traveling speaker or something like that in the midst of an assembly that came on Sundays and Wednesdays and a few programs thrown in to boot. But in the family with 100 fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, guess what happens? My children are very well cared for, and in fact, they need the gifts that are in Steve and John and Philip and Paul and Ruth and Ann and Sally and Sarah. They need those gifts in their life And I should not be their only experience of Christian maturity, if I even be that. I mean, they should be exposed to adults in an environment where constantly somebody's taking them out and walking with them through the woods and saying the kingdom of God is sort of like this tree here, or like this field, or like this duck pond, and be able to walk through life with them. And if I happen to be out of town and my children happen to be back behind, if they have 100 fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, they actually could be stronger when I get back than when I left, and probably should be, if people are caring for them the way Jesus said they would be in the family of God. So while I have to say that the fundamental problem with children isn't so much what to do with them in meetings as it is how do we view them. Are they an inheritance from God? Are they a problem that gets in the way while we try to have our important meetings? Well, let the little children come to me, Jesus said, at a very critical time in an important meeting. It's like they're a part of our lives. And so, definitely if the youngest of the children that have no comprehension at all of hearing or seeing anything, they have no comprehension, if the youngest of the children are perhaps in homes with families and, with adults that are spending time with them and pouring into them while the rest of the church is together, well, that's fine and that's good. But certainly, overall, the package needs to be that the children, especially as they come to be able to understand and think, and they know what prayer is, they know who God is, they know what obedience is, as they come to some understanding of the human language and the ability to turn their face towards a God they can't see with their eyes, they ought to be woven into our lives, and I don't know why that wouldn't include meetings too. So, granted, they can be a distraction. Babies crying can certainly be a distraction to some extent, but somehow there needs to be a commitment to children as well as lonely being set in families and in the family of God to where they can identify with being with the people of God and not just something that eventually when they get to be in high school they graduate to. Again, I'm familiar with all the problems with toddlers and certainly caring for kids that really can't even understand the English language or whatever language a person happens to speak, for them to be cared for and watched and loved on and sung to and that in maybe a different setting while the gathering's going on, well and good. But the overall picture ought to be that the children are woven into the family of God, into adults' lives, and even in a large gathering to stop and take the time of, hey, we've been talking about all these things, and there's a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, an 8-year-old. Hey, what do you guys think? Are you understanding any of this? Because we're family, we can stop and talk about it. Because it's not a show that we're putting on, we can stop and ask them what they understand or explain it to them a little more clearly in examples that they can understand. But God setting the lonely and the children in families, as well as the hearts of the fathers turning to the children and the children to the fathers, is a big part of this whole thing. And what gets in the way of that, just as always, is our priorities. If it's an inconvenience to us, it's a frustration, we just want somebody to babysit the kids and get them out of our way, they're a distraction. Whatever the problem is, oftentimes it's the heart that causes us to not be sensitive and to dish them off into something else. So be thinking about that, whatever you decide to do. And again, in your lives, there'll be a dynamic to it. I'm intentionally not going to give you a specific of this or that or the other, because I want you to see that these children have got to be part of your lives. 100 fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters. And as it relates to meetings, there'll be dynamics, things that change, things that come and go, seasons and different ways from one day to the next, let alone 1 year to the next, of how you deal with different children of different ages. But whatever you do, don't rely on a program to seemingly be their surrogate parents and the surrogate church for them, because their futures are at stake, and whether or not they're part of 100 fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, or they're just dished off to a hired man to be a surrogate parent for them. So think about that real hard, and we'll pray that you'll have wisdom, because this is a challenging area, but don't get lazy. Work it hard, pray through it, and be willing to sacrifice your own self for the sake of those that are weaker or younger.